So, are we ready to vote? My daughter-in-law said, smiling across the Thanksgiving table as if she were asking who wanted more cranberry sauce. But the room went quiet in a way I had never heard before in my 72 years. That was the moment I realized dinner was not the real reason everyone had gathered in my dining room that evening. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and until that night I believed Thanksgiving was still about family, about warm food and old memories, and the comfort of knowing you belong somewhere. I had spent the entire day preparing for that dinner, the same way I had for more than 40 years. The turkey had been in the oven since 10 in the morning, slowly roasting while the smell of sage stuffing and butter drifted through the house Robert and I bought back in 1981. Outside the windows, the late November sky was turning that pale gray color that comes just before sunset, and a cold wind rattled the branches of the maple tree Robert planted when our son Daniel was born. For most of the afternoon, I moved quietly through the kitchen, checking the thermometer in the turkey, stirring the gravy, setting the table with the good china that only came out twice a year. Robert used to say Thanksgiving was his favorite day because the house always felt alive. But Robert had been gone for almost 8 months now, and the house felt different, like a place that was trying to remember what happiness used to sound like. Still, I did my best to keep the traditions alive. By 5:30, the table was set for 6. Daniel sat across from me, his shoulders stiff, his eyes moving toward his wife every few seconds, as if waiting for instructions. Rachel sat beside him, perfectly composed in a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my entire grocery bill that week. My granddaughter Emily was at the far end of the table, quietly pushing her fork through a pile of mashed potatoes while watching the rest of us with a look that felt older than her 19 years. Everything seemed normal at first. We passed the dishes around the table, Daniel complimented the turkey, and Rachel laughed politely at something Emily said about her college classes. But underneath those small conversations there was something else in the room. A kind of tension that moved silently between people, like a storm building somewhere far away. I noticed it in the way Daniel avoided my eyes. I noticed it in the way Rachel kept glancing at the clock on the kitchen wall. I noticed it in the way Emily barely touched her food. Then, just as I was reaching for the gravy boat, Rachel cleared her throat and folded her hands neatly on the table. The sound of silverware stopped almost instantly. Even the refrigerator humming in the kitchen seemed louder than usual. Rachel looked directly at me, her smile calm and careful, the kind of smile people use when they believe they are about to win something important. Before dessert, she said softly, "Daniel and I thought it might be a good idea for the family to talk about something." Daniel nodded quickly beside her, though he still didn't look at me. I felt a strange heaviness settle in my chest, the kind of feeling you get when you know a conversation is about to change something permanently. Rachel's smile widened just slightly as she rested her elbows on the table and looked around the room. "We think it's time," she continued, "for a family vote." For a moment no one spoke. The word hung in the air like something misplaced, something that didn't belong in a Thanksgiving dinner conversation. I glanced at Daniel, expecting him to laugh and explain that this was some kind of misunderstanding, but he only stared down at his plate. Emily shifted in her chair and finally looked at me with an expression that made my stomach tighten. That was when Rachel leaned forward and said the words that changed everything. "The vote," she said gently, "is about whether Margaret should still be living in this house." For several seconds, no one moved. The ticking clock on the kitchen wall suddenly sounded louder than it had all evening, each second stretching across the silence like a slow drumbeat. I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the edge of the tablecloth, trying to understand what I had just heard. A vote. About whether I should still be living in my own home. The words felt strange in my mind, like a sentence spoken in the wrong language. This was the same dining room where Daniel had celebrated his 10th birthday with chocolate cake and paper decorations. The same table where Robert had carved the turkey every November while pretending he was a professional chef on television. For decades, this room had held laughter, arguments, stories, and quiet family moments. Now the air inside it felt cold and unfamiliar. Rachel folded her hands neatly in front of her as if she were hosting a business meeting instead of Thanksgiving dinner. Her voice remained calm, measured, almost gentle. She said they had been concerned about me for some time. She said Daniel, and she believed the house had become too much responsibility for someone my age. The way she spoke made it sound like a thoughtful decision, something carefully considered for my own good. Daniel finally cleared his throat, but he still would not look directly at me. He repeated Rachel's words about safety and responsibility, explaining that large houses require maintenance and attention. His voice sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced the explanation several times before this moment. I listened without interrupting. That was something Robert had always admired about me. He used to say that when people talk long enough, they eventually reveal more than they intended. Rachel continued speaking, explaining that assisted living communities offered activities, medical staff, and companionship for older residents. She described sunny courtyards and comfortable apartments as if she were reading from a travel brochure. While she spoke, I slowly looked around the table. Emily sat very still, her fingers wrapped around her water glass. She was watching Rachel with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite fear. Daniel shifted in his chair again and again, the leg of the chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. He kept glancing toward Rachel the same way he had all evening, waiting for her to continue, waiting for her approval. I suddenly realized something I had not noticed before. This conversation had not started tonight. The discussion had been happening for weeks, maybe longer, in quiet moments when I was not in the room. I thought about the small changes in the house over the past few months. Rachel organizing the kitchen cabinets without asking me. Daniel suggesting that perhaps I should stop driving long distances because traffic was stressful. Even the new real estate flyers I had once seen on the kitchen counter before Rachel quickly moved them aside. At the time, I told myself those things were coincidences. Families change after a loss. People adjust in different ways. But sitting there at that table, I felt the pieces slowly fitting together, like a puzzle that had been scattered across the past several months. Rachel finished her explanation and leaned back slightly in her chair. She looked satisfied, confident, as if the outcome had already been decided. Then she glanced around the table and said that everyone present deserved a voice in the decision. She said families should work together when making important choices. Finally, her eyes returned to me, calm and patient, waiting for my reaction. I noticed something else in that moment. Not one person at the table had actually asked me what I wanted. No one spoke after Rachel finished her explanation. The silence around the table felt thick, like the air had suddenly become heavier. I looked down at my plate for a moment, studying the slice of turkey that had grown cold while everyone discussed my future as if I were not sitting 3 feet away. Then I slowly lifted my eyes again and met Rachel's gaze. Her expression remained calm, almost sympathetic, the kind of look people use when they believe they are being reasonable. Daniel finally shifted in his chair and cleared his throat again. This time he forced himself to look directly at me, though the eye contact lasted only a second before his attention drifted back toward the table. He began explaining that the idea had come up after several conversations about the house. He said the property was large and old, nearly 40 years since Robert and I had first moved in. Maintenance costs were rising. The yard alone covered almost half an acre, and the roof would eventually need replacing. Daniel spoke carefully, like someone choosing words from a script. He said they only wanted what was best for me. Rachel nodded beside him, adding that modern retirement communities were wonderful places. She described walking paths, social clubs, and weekly events for residents. She said people my age often found new friendships there and enjoyed a lifestyle free from the burdens of homeownership. Her tone was polite and professional, almost like a real estate presentation. I noticed that Emily had stopped eating entirely. She was watching Rachel now with a tight expression on her face, her eyebrows drawn slightly together. When Rachel finished speaking, Emily finally asked a quiet question. She asked when this conversation had started. Rachel answered quickly, saying the family had been discussing it privately for a while because they did not want to upset me too soon. Daniel nodded again, though the movement looked hesitant this time. That answer confirmed something inside my mind. This vote had not been an impulsive idea brought up during dinner. It had been planned carefully. The timing, the explanations, even the calm tone of Rachel's voice all suggested preparation. I thought back over the last several months since Robert passed away. At first, everyone had been kind and attentive. Daniel visited frequently, and Rachel offered to help organize the house while I adjusted to living alone. But gradually things had changed in ways I had not fully understood at the time. Certain drawers in the kitchen had been rearranged. My old paperwork had been moved into boxes labeled storage. Rachel had begun handling small household decisions without asking me first. I remembered the afternoon when she mentioned that many older homeowners eventually chose to downsize. At the time, I assumed she was simply making conversation. Now the memory felt different. Daniel reached for his glass of water and took a long drink before continuing. He said the family believed a vote would be the fairest way to decide what should happen next. Everyone at the table would share their opinion, and together they would determine the best path forward. The phrase "best path forward" sounded strangely formal, as though he were discussing a business project instead of his own mother. Rachel smiled again, her fingers folded neatly together as she looked around the table. She asked if everyone was ready to begin. And as I looked from face to face in that quiet room, I realized something even more troubling than the vote itself. They all seemed to believe the decision had already been made. For a moment, I considered speaking immediately, saying something sharp enough to stop the entire conversation. But Robert once told me that silence is sometimes more powerful than argument. So instead of reacting, I simply folded my hands in my lap and looked around the table again. Rachel noticed the movement and tilted her head slightly, as if she were studying me. She probably expected anger or confusion, maybe even tears. Instead, I gave her a small, calm smile. The kind of smile you offer when you are listening carefully. Daniel shifted in his seat again. He seemed uncomfortable with the quiet, like someone who had hoped this conversation would move quickly and end before anyone had time to think too deeply about it. Finally, Rachel spoke again. She explained that the vote was not meant to hurt anyone's feelings. She said it was simply a way for the family to discuss practical concerns. She reminded everyone that large homes can become difficult for older people to maintain. She mentioned stairs, repairs, and winter heating costs. Each explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, carefully chosen words stacked together like neat blocks in a tidy argument. But something about the tone felt rehearsed. I leaned back slightly in my chair and glanced toward the window beside the dining room. The maple tree outside swayed gently in the cold November wind. Robert planted that tree the same spring Daniel learned how to ride a bicycle. I remembered Robert standing in the yard with a shovel, explaining that trees take patience. He said the strongest ones grow slowly, but last the longest. The memory came to me so clearly that for a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. Robert believed in planning ahead. During our 42 years of marriage, he handled most of the financial details because he enjoyed that kind of organization. I trusted him completely. When something needed signing, he would bring the papers to the kitchen table, explain them briefly, and we would finish the process together. He often joked that paperwork was simply another kind of gardening. You planted the right things early so they could protect the future. I realized Rachel was still speaking while I thought about those old conversations. She had begun listing examples of retirement communities again, describing comfortable apartments, group activities, and scheduled transportation to shopping centers. Daniel nodded along with every point she made. Emily remained silent, but her eyes moved between Rachel and me as if she were watching a tennis match. Rachel eventually finished and rested her hands on the table again. She looked pleased with the explanation, confident that logic had settled the matter. I slowly lifted my water glass and took a small sip before setting it down carefully beside my plate. Then I spoke for the first time since the vote had been mentioned. My voice was calm and steady, the same tone I had used when Daniel was a child and needed guidance instead of anger. I simply asked one question. I asked who had suggested the vote in the first place. Daniel opened his mouth as if he wanted to answer, but Rachel spoke before he could say anything. She said the idea had been mutual. She said the entire family had discussed it together because everyone cared about my well-being. I nodded slowly as if considering her words. But inside my mind another thought was beginning to take shape. Robert used to say that when people hurry to explain something, it usually means there is more truth hiding underneath the explanation. Emily finally set her fork down against her plate with a soft clink that seemed louder than it should have been. For a moment she hesitated, glancing at her father and then at Rachel before looking back at me. I could see the conflict in her expression, the way young people struggle when they realize something around them is not as simple as it first appeared. Rachel noticed the movement immediately. Her eyes shifted toward Emily with a quick, warning look that lasted only a second, but did not escape my attention. Then Rachel turned back to me with the same calm smile she had been wearing all evening. She said that difficult conversations are never easy, but families must sometimes make responsible decisions together. Daniel nodded again, repeating that this was about planning ahead. He explained that many people my age eventually choose smaller homes or retirement communities because life becomes simpler there. His words sounded careful, almost apologetic, yet he still avoided meeting my eyes for more than a moment. I listened quietly. The strange thing about that moment was not the suggestion that I should move. It was the certainty in Rachel's voice when she spoke about the future of the house. She did not sound like someone offering an idea. She sounded like someone describing a plan already in motion. Emily shifted again in her chair and finally spoke, her voice hesitant but clear. She asked what would happen to the house if I moved. The question hung in the air for a second before Rachel answered. Rachel explained that Daniel and she had already discussed renovating the property so it could be more practical for their family. She mentioned opening the kitchen walls, replacing the floors, and possibly building a larger living room. She spoke about those changes with surprising detail, the kind of detail people usually have after long conversations with contractors or real estate agents. Daniel looked slightly startled when she said that, as if the explanation had gone further than he expected. But Rachel continued smoothly, describing how the house could become a perfect place for raising children someday. Emily's eyes widened slightly at that. She looked from Rachel to Daniel and then back to me. I could almost see the realization forming in her mind. The vote was not only about my safety or comfort. It was also about the house itself. I rested my hands gently on the table again and studied Rachel carefully. Her confidence had grown stronger with every sentence. She believed the argument was working. She believed everyone in the room would eventually agree that her version of the future made sense. For a moment no one spoke again. The quiet felt different now, heavier with unspoken understanding. I looked at Daniel and noticed the uncertainty on his face, the way he seemed to be realizing how far the conversation had moved beyond a simple discussion. Rachel, however, remained perfectly composed. She leaned forward slightly and said that the vote should begin soon so everyone could enjoy dessert afterward. The way she said it made the decision sound inevitable, like the final step in a process that had already been decided long before Thanksgiving dinner ever started. For several seconds I said nothing. I let Rachel's words settle over the table like a thin layer of dust. She was waiting for resistance, I realized. She expected an argument, perhaps even a scene that would allow her to present herself as the calm and reasonable one. But Robert taught me long ago that people often reveal more when they believe they have already won. So instead of protesting, I nodded slowly as if I were carefully considering everything she had said. Rachel noticed the nod and her shoulders relaxed slightly, a small signal of confidence returning to her posture. Daniel looked relieved as well, as though he had been bracing himself for something more uncomfortable. Emily, however, was still watching me closely. I could see the questions in her eyes. I rested my hands gently on the edge of the table and spoke in the same quiet tone I had used all evening. I told them I appreciated their concern. I said that planning for the future was always wise, especially after a loss like Robert's passing. Rachel's smile widened just a little at that. She leaned forward again, her voice warm and encouraging, saying she was glad I understood their intentions. Daniel nodded again, repeating that everything they were suggesting was meant to help me live more comfortably. I listened carefully to the way he phrased that sentence. Help me live more comfortably. It was a thoughtful phrase, but it still avoided one simple truth. No one had asked me whether I wanted to leave my home. I reached for my water glass again, took a slow sip, and placed it back on the table. Then I said something that surprised everyone at the table, including Rachel. I told them that if the family truly believed a vote was necessary, then we should go ahead and hold the vote. The reaction was immediate but subtle. Rachel blinked once, clearly pleased that the process would move forward. Daniel shifted again in his chair, his expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Emily sat up straighter, looking from my face to Rachel's as if she suspected something deeper was unfolding. Rachel quickly regained her confident tone and said that she was grateful I was willing to participate calmly. She explained that each person would simply share their opinion about what should happen next. The process, she said, would only take a few minutes. I nodded again. The truth was that while Rachel had been speaking earlier, a memory had quietly returned to my mind. It was a memory from nearly 3 years ago, long before Robert became ill. One afternoon, he had called me into his study where several folders were spread across the desk. He told me he wanted to organize certain legal documents, just in case something unexpected ever happened. At the time, I laughed and told him he was worrying too much. Robert only smiled and said that preparation was never a bad idea. Sitting there at the Thanksgiving table now, I could still picture the calm confidence in his expression that afternoon. The same calm confidence that had guided our family through many difficult decisions over the years. I folded my hands again and looked around the table, allowing a quiet smile to rest on my face. Rachel believed the vote would decide my future. But deep inside, I was beginning to remember something important Robert had arranged, something that made the entire conversation unfolding around me far less certain than Rachel imagined. Rachel clasped her hands together lightly as if the evening had finally reached the moment she had been waiting for. She looked around the table with the quiet authority of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. Daniel shifted in his seat again and rubbed his palms against his jeans as though he wished the whole conversation would move along faster. Emily sat very still, her eyes moving slowly from one face to another. I watched all of them carefully before speaking again. I told Rachel she should go ahead and explain how the vote would work. She smiled politely and said it was very simple. Each person would share whether they believed it was time for me to move somewhere more suitable, and then the family would agree on the best path forward. She spoke the words clearly, almost gently, as though she believed kindness in her voice would make the decision easier to accept. Daniel nodded and said that no one wanted me to feel pressured. He insisted this was simply a family discussion about the future. The phrase family discussion made Emily glance down at the table. Rachel leaned forward slightly and suggested that Daniel speak first since he was my son. Daniel inhaled slowly, then looked toward me for the briefest moment before lowering his gaze again. He said that he loved me and that everything he was saying came from concern. He explained that the house required too much upkeep and that winters had become harder in recent years. He said assisted living communities offered safety and companionship. While he spoke, I noticed Rachel watching him carefully, as though making sure he stayed close to the message she wanted delivered. When Daniel finished, Rachel nodded approvingly and turned toward Emily. She asked Emily what she thought would be best. Emily hesitated. She looked at me first, then back at Rachel. For a long moment, she did not answer. Finally, she said she believed the person who lived in the house should have the strongest voice in the decision. Rachel's smile tightened slightly at that response, though she recovered quickly and said everyone's opinion mattered equally in a family matter. Emily did not argue further, but the quiet tension in her shoulders remained. Rachel then turned back toward me with the same composed expression she had maintained all evening. She asked if I would like to share my thoughts before the final vote was counted. I folded my hands together and looked slowly around the table again. The house felt very still in that moment. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, and the faint smell of pumpkin pie drifted from the counter where dessert waited untouched. I thought again about Robert sitting at this same table years ago, calmly reviewing papers and explaining that preparation protected the future. The memory settled in my mind like a quiet reassurance. I lifted my eyes back to Rachel and gave a small nod. I told her the family could go ahead and finish the vote. After all, if everyone believed the decision was already clear, there was no reason to delay it any longer. The room grew quiet again after I agreed to let the vote continue. Rachel straightened slightly in her chair, the confidence in her posture returning almost immediately. She glanced at Daniel as if inviting him to confirm what everyone already seemed to expect. Daniel cleared his throat and shifted his weight forward. He said that although the decision was difficult, he believed moving to a smaller place would be better for me. He explained that assisted living communities offered safety, medical support, and neighbors my own age. His voice was careful and measured, the same tone he used when explaining complicated things to clients at work. When he finished, he looked down at the table again as though the conversation might disappear if he avoided eye contact long enough. Rachel nodded approvingly beside him. Then she said, gently but firmly, that she agreed completely. She repeated that large homes could become overwhelming and that families sometimes needed to make responsible decisions for their loved ones. Her expression carried the quiet certainty of someone who believed the matter was already settled. Emily was the last person left to speak. She hesitated again, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her napkin. Finally, she looked at me and said that she believed I should be the one deciding where I lived. Rachel responded quickly that sometimes families needed to help make those decisions together. Emily did not argue further, but the disappointment on her face was clear. Rachel folded her hands together and looked around the table one more time before announcing that the majority seemed to support the idea of me moving somewhere more suitable. She said the family would help me find a comfortable place and handle the transition as smoothly as possible. The words were polite, almost generous in tone, yet they carried the finality of a decision already made. I listened without interrupting. Then I slowly pushed my chair back from the table and stood up. The movement drew everyone's attention immediately. Rachel's smile faded slightly as she watched me step toward the small side table near the dining room wall. On that table sat an old wooden box where Robert and I used to keep various household papers. I opened the box calmly and removed a thin folder. When I returned to the table, I placed the folder gently in front of Rachel. Daniel looked confused. Emily leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing the tension in her expression. Rachel hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were several neatly organized documents. She scanned the first page quickly, and the calm certainty in her expression shifted into visible surprise. Daniel leaned closer to see what she was reading. The papers were copies of legal documents Robert had arranged several years earlier. They explained that the house was part of a family trust created long before his passing. According to the terms written clearly on those pages, the property could not be sold, transferred, or renovated without the approval of the trustee. And the trustee listed on that document was not Daniel, and it was certainly not Rachel. The trustee was me. For several seconds, no one spoke. Rachel stared at the documents as though the words on the page might change if she looked at them long enough. Daniel leaned closer, reading over her shoulder, his expression shifting slowly from confusion to disbelief. Emily sat very still, her eyes moving between the papers and my face. The quiet in the room felt different now, heavier but also clearer, like a storm that had already passed. I rested my hands calmly on the edge of the table and allowed them time to finish reading. Finally, Rachel looked up at me. The confidence that had filled her voice earlier in the evening was gone. She asked what the documents meant. Her tone was careful now, almost cautious. I explained that several years earlier Robert had created a family trust as part of his estate planning. He believed it was important to protect the home that had been part of our lives for more than 4 decades. The trust document stated that the property would remain under my control for as long as I chose to live there. Any decision involving the house, including selling it, renovating it, or transferring ownership, required the approval of the trustee. I paused for a moment before adding that the trustee named in the documents was me. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair as the meaning of that statement settled over the table. Rachel looked down at the papers again, turning one page as if searching for something that might contradict what she had just heard. But the language was clear. Robert had been very precise with details. I remembered him sitting at his desk years ago explaining that preparation was the best way to protect the people you love. At the time I had laughed and told him he was being overly cautious. Now I understood why he had taken the time to arrange everything so carefully. Rachel finally closed the folder and placed it back on the table. The confidence that had guided the conversation earlier had completely disappeared from her expression. Daniel looked at me again, this time without avoiding my eyes. He seemed to be struggling with the realization that the entire discussion about votes and decisions had been built on an assumption that was never true. I spoke quietly, keeping my voice calm and steady. I said that I appreciated their concern about my future, but the truth was very simple. The house was protected by Robert's planning, and I had no intention of leaving it. I reminded them that families should talk openly before making decisions that affect someone's life. Emily let out a small breath that sounded almost like relief. Rachel remained silent. I gently closed the folder and returned it to the wooden box on the side table. When I sat down again, the room felt different than it had at the beginning of dinner. The vote that Rachel had expected to decide my future no longer mattered. Robert had already made sure of that years ago. I looked around the table one more time and said that the turkey was getting cold and that we should probably finish dinner before dessert. No one argued with that suggestion. The conversation about votes quietly disappeared, leaving only the steady ticking of the kitchen clock and the quiet understanding that sometimes the calmest person at the table is the one who prepared the most carefully.